So let's talk about the Chinese peace proposal for Ukraine and the possibility of Chinese weapon shipments to Russia. So, Twitter has been a buzz online today after the Chinese put out a 10-point peace proposal. Now, usually we would go through the 10-point peace proposal, but much of the 10-point peace proposal is stuff that we've heard or seen before about guaranteeing grain exports and trying to protect nuclear facilities across Ukraine, stuff like that. So we're going to go through the article, we're going to read the basics of it, we're going to talk about it, and I'm going to tell you guys how it's too vague to really, I think, cause any movement. And it seems to be a little sympathetic to the Russian position. In fact, I would say a little too sympathetic to the Russian position, which isn't surprising considering Russia and China's relationship. And as American intelligence officials are saying, that China might be considering sending weapons to the Russians. So let's read the article. 1 year into Russia's war against Ukraine, China is offering a 12-point proposal to end the fighting. The proposal follows China's recent announcement that it is trying to act as a mediator in the war that has re-energized Western alliances viewed by Beijing and Moscow as rivals. China's top diplomat indicated that the plan was coming at a security conference this week in Munich, Germany. With its release, President Xi Jinping's government is reiterating China's claim to be neutral, despite blocking efforts at the United Nations to condemn the invasion. Of the 141 nations that condemned the invasion, China was one of the 35 abstentions instead of the 7 nations that voted against. I think it was 5 or 7 that voted against. So China abstained on condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I guess to me, if you're abstaining on whether the war could have should have happened in the first place, I think it's hard for you to find a peaceful resolution to it, because only somebody who studied the conflict of the war could come to the conclusion that it needed to be condemned. And without that type of reflection, it's hard for me to think that the Chinese can properly organize an end to it. But let's keep going. I've been wrong before. At the Munich meeting, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken expressed skepticism about Beijing's position before the plan's release. He said China has been providing non-lethal assistance that supports Russian President Vladimir Putin's war effort, and said that U.S. intelligence that Beijing is considering providing lethal support. China has called the allegation a smear and said it lacks evidence. What has China proposed? China's proposal calls for a ceasefire and peace talks and an end to sanctions against Russia. China placed responsibility for sanctions on the other relevant countries without naming them. Again, they're blaming the response on Russia's invasion on the responding nations and not the nation that started the invasion in the first place. Seems to be very little condemnation of the invasion or the nation causing the whole mess in the first place in this 12-point plan, but a lot of finger waving at the West. These countries, it said, should stop abusing unilateral sanctions and do their share in de-escalating the Ukraine crisis. It's hard to argue towards the West that they should de-escalate as the Russians take tens of thousands of prisoners, throw them into the fray, as well as recruiting and drafting hundreds of thousands of Russians to do their fighting. It's hard for me to take it too seriously when they're saying from the West, de-escalate, 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 and Russia dumps more and more fuel on the fire that they started in the first place. Many of the 12 points were very general and did not contain specific proposals, and this is the main reason why I think this can be kind of largely overlooked and probably won't be talked about much in the media. Without mentioning either Russia or Ukraine, it says sovereignty of all nations should be upheld. It didn't specify what that would look like for Ukraine and the land taken from it since Russia seized Crimea in 2014. And this is the thing, and this is the problem I'm gonna fall into with this peace proposal. A lot of it's platitudes. Like, for example, it'd be like me saying, in my peace proposal, we're calling for an end of war crimes. It's like, okay, that's a nice thing, but what does that mean in actuality? Are we going to elect a special prosecutor to go after war criminals in this war? Are we going to start a commission to bring these people to justice? Is the International Criminal Court going to get involved here? And will Russia and Ukraine allow them to operate within their territory? No. None of that is brushed upon. None of that is talked about. And when it comes to the respecting of territorial integrity, that isn't highlighted or cleared up at all. And it's just like, respect territorial integrity. Well, if you go with international institutions, international law, that would mean Russia returning Zaporozhye, all of Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea to Ukraine, since all of that is internationally recognized as Ukrainian territory. But that's not what Russia calls for here. I mean, what China calls for here. And it instead, just has the platitude of territorial integrity. The proposal also condemns a Cold War mentality, a term that often refers to the United States and the U.S. European military alliance NATO. The security of a region should not be achieved by strengthening or expanding military blocs, the proposal says. Russian President Vladimir Putin demands a promise that Ukraine will not join the bloc before the invasion. This is the thing, though. All of the nations that didn't get invaded by Russia were part of the security bloc. So whether people like that or not, the security bloc has been proven time and time and time again, whether it be in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, whatever country you want to bring up, okay? They have proven that being in NATO stops Russia from invading you. It just does. Because if Russia was to invade you, they would have to go to war with not only Estonia, because Estonia is a nation, for example, that's very small military. It does not have enough firepower to fight against the Russian invasion if it was to happen alone. But if it is with all of NATO, it's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Czechia, Bosnia, Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States. They would not be able to fight all of them. And so that has stopped a Russian invasion. And so whether we like it or not, the end of this war, when we talk about a ceasefire, has to be with Ukraine in some sort of military alliance. We cannot kick the can down the road. If we write a ceasefire and then have a peace deal that does not have Ukraine in a position where if a future invasion was to happen, it could dissuade it, we could just be kicking this can down the road. All we could be doing is delaying this violence for 5 years, patting ourselves on the back for a peace deal that won't work, and then we're just going to have Minsk Accords 3. Failed again, didn't achieve anything. And so we need to make sure that Ukraine is in some sort of alliance structure once this war is over. Doesn't have to be NATO, even though NATO is the most obvious candidate, and the majority of Ukrainians want to join NATO, and Ukraine is as actively requested to be part of the alliance structure, and the majority of NATO states are sympathetic to Ukraine joining. Putting all that aside, it could be a defensive agreement between the United States and Ukraine, France and Ukraine, Germany and Ukraine, and the UK and Ukraine, with enough states that are a member of NATO that Ukraine could technically not be in NATO, but then have the direct support of all these nation states dissuading an invasion, since the Turks, basically, I think under no circumstances in the near future, are going to be accepting Ukraine inside of NATO, since they're already giving us enough trouble over Finland and Sweden's membership. Anyway, continuing. Other points call for a ceasefire, peace talks, protection for prisoners of war, and stopping attacks on civilians without elaborating, as well as keeping nuclear power plants safe and facilitating grain exports. So again, large platitudes that we've kind of already heard before. Talks of a ceasefire mean nothing to the Ukrainians and possibly the Russians, outside of a quick delay in fighting, if it would not be followed with immediate successful peace talks. And to the Ukrainians, to negotiate a ceasefire now for a period of time before restarting fighting would just be giving the Russians time to, breathe, recuperate, regather their forces, and start another offensive, where right now they're grinding them down in eastern Ukraine and putting themselves under pressure through how many troops they're losing every day. Do the Ukrainians really want to give the Russians the breathing room to invade them later? If they don't have a guarantee that a ceasefire would lead to peace and a sustainable, fair peace, it's going to be a hard pitch to the Ukrainians. The basic tone and the fundamental message in the policy is quite pro-Russia, said Li Minjiang, a professor of the Chinese foreign policy and international strategy, international security at Singapore's Nanyang Technology University. Does China back Russia in its war on Ukraine? China has offered contradictory statements regarding its stance. It says Russia was provoked into taking action by NATO's eastward expansion, but has also claimed neutrality on the war. Now, can I, and I've said this before, but I'll say it again in case anybody's missed me. Ukraine wasn't going to join NATO. I mean, it didn't have a path to NATO membership before the invasion. The war in Ukraine wasn't heating up before they invaded. I think in 2021, there was like 20-something deaths entirely, right? And it was mostly through IED explosions, people stepping on landmines. And Ukraine can't join NATO unless they get Turkey's approval, which is going to be very difficult, or they completely it's and they have to expel the Russians from all of Ukrainian territory and or give up Crimea and all the territory that the Russians control, because you cannot have territorial disputes and join NATO. So Ukraine was no closer to joining NATO when they launched this invasion. So saying like, oh, this is all because of the eastward expansion, I think is very shallow analysis. Did eastward expansion have something to do with it? Probably to some extent, but I don't think it was the instigating factor here, because they were no closer to joining NATO. Ahead of Russia's attack, Xi and Putin attended the opening at last year's Winter Olympics in Beijing and issued a statement that their governments had a no-limits friendship. China has since ignored Western criticism and reaffirmed that pledge. Putin has said he expects Xi to visit Russia in the next few months. China has yet to confirm that. China is trying to have it both ways, Blinken said on Sunday. Publicly, they present themselves as a country striving for peace in Ukraine, but privately, as I've said, we've already seen over these past months the provision of non-lethal assistance that does go directly to aiding and abetting Russia war efforts. I'd like to hear more details about that. Has China provided support to Russia? China's support for Russia has been largely rhetorical and political. Beijing has helped to prevent efforts to condemn Moscow at the United Nations. Well, oof, that didn't work a few days ago with even Brazil and members of the BRICS nation coalition, which the Yankee Tanky told me and many others was a strong alliance that would have no cracks in it. Brazil has condemned the Russian invasion in the last UN vote. There is no public evidence it is currently supplying arms to Russia, but the U.S. has said China is providing non-lethal support already and may do more. Blinken at the Munich conference said the United States has long been concerned that China will provide weapons to Russia. We have information that gives us concern that they are considering possibly lethal support to Russia. Blinken said he expressed to the Chinese envoy to the meeting, Yang Wei, that this would be a serious problem. I mean, this would not only be a serious problem, but it would most likely come with sanctions of some sort. NATO's chief said Wednesday he had seen some signs that China may be ready to provide arms and warned that it would be supporting a violation of international law. That is true. As I've said before, when it comes to selling weapons and weapon shipments and aid shipments of weapons, sending weapons to the nation that is being invaded and having the crime of the war of aggression done against them is legal under international law. Sending it to the aggressor is illegal under international law. This isn't a debate. This isn't a question. This is just fact. Now, you can disagree with international law, but under international law, this would be illegal. Russian and Chinese forces have held joint drills since the invasion, most recently with the South African Navy in shipping lanes off the South African coast. Ukraine's defense minister, Oleksiy Reznikov, expressed doubt about China's willingness to send lethal aid to Russia. I think if China will help them, it will not be weaponry. It will be some kind of thing like clothes. Now, if you want my opinion, I would agree with that. Now, of course, I could be wrong. American intelligence could be right. It could be right either way, and maybe China just backs off of it. But it could be true that China ends up sending weapons to Ukraine. The reason why I am not ready to accept that reality right now is just due to the fact that, number one, it would come with a lot of sanctions, and those sanctions and international isolation it would come with. Very few nations in the world would view this as a good thing. As we can see from the UN vote, the vast majority of nations see this as a crime of aggression, and they're right to see it that way. Does China want to isolate themselves internationally like that? After making all these arguments on how they're better than the realist Americans and the Kissingerite policies, do they really want to send weapons to the Russians after sending weapons to the genocidal regime in Myanmar? Definitely, when there's not too much to benefit when it comes to China's direct foreign policy interests. What do they get out of Ukraine? Do they get resources? Do they get people? Do they get economic innovation? No, they get nothing. They get nothing out of it. The only thing they get out of it is maybe an ally that has more of an ability to stand up on its own and more of a standing military force. That's the only way you can cut it. And that's assuming that Russia is solidly China's ally and doesn't have a lot of disagreements with it when it comes to national security concerns, which it most certainly has, just like Brazil and China has, which has caused border skirmishes on their borderline. So I think the idea that China is going to provide these weapons when it could come with large-scale sanctions and possibly blocking them, a lot of their markets access to the many more American consumers and much larger American financial market than the Russian financial market, it seems like a very big risk for very little direct reward for the Chinese. So I guess I would like to know what type of logic would go behind the Chinese decision to send weapons to the Russians. Of course, even according to American intelligence, they haven't made a decision on this. Whether they're going to go through with it or not, we don't know. We do not know for sure. Now, I will say that outside of the fact that this peace deal it seems to have some pretty big sympathies for the Russian narrative, Ukraine isn't completely disregarding it. In fact, Ukraine has said that they do see some merit in the Chinese peace plan. The main piece of merit that I saw was not only the idea that, of course, we are fine with mediation, but it was the idea that the Chinese, under no circumstances, want to endorse the use of potentially world-ending weapons, aka nuclear weapons. And I've said this before, and I will say it again. One of the biggest things that could isolate Russia from the rest of the world right now and make their situation worse is the use of nuclear warheads. And it's part of the reason why I don't have a massive concern about them using them. And the reason why is if they were to use them, not only would that cause possible radiological spillover, and depending on the weather, that could be a big issue for the Russians, but it would also come with massive amounts of diplomatic isolation as they break the nuclear taboo for the first time since 1945, over 80 something years, and they break that taboo as the world has more nuclear weapons than ever, weapons that could destroy the world 2-3 times over. And now they want to break that taboo, and not break the taboo because their territorial integrity was threatened, as they say is Russian policy, but because their invasion of Ukraine failed and was a dud. It's ridiculous. Could you imagine the United States invades Vietnam, and then we say, oh, damn, we're losing. Better nuke the Vietnamese. I mean, the last time this was even openly really touted as something that was even possible, really, it was somewhat talked about behind closed doors in Vietnam. It was never brought to public. It was never given a real fair shake because people looked at the plan, they considered it, and they said this is insane, was the Korean War. And why was it floated during the Korean War? Douglas MacArthur being Douglas MacArthur, and the fact that we were really the only world power with nukes. That was until 1953 when the Russians started doing nuclear tests. But at first, we were the only world power with nukes. And since then, the situation has changed drastically. It was a lot more likely that we used nukes during the Korean War than it is today, considering how many military officials, namely Douglas MacArthur, was openly floating it. And the repercussions for such a move would be on a much smaller scale than they would be today, since the nuclear taboo has developed so much, international trade and globalization has developed so much, and more sanctions and cutting off with price caps would be very damaging for the Russians, and the destructiveness of said weapons being able to destroy the world 2-3 times over now has greatly improved. And so if we wouldn't use the weapons in that war, it makes me very hard to believe that the Russians will use the weapons now, definitely considering this is one of the few scenarios, as China is somewhat indicating here with this peace proposal, quote-unquote peace proposal, this would be one of the few scenarios where the Chinese and the Indians might agree to a price cap on Russian energy exports, further damaging the Russian economy. And that's on top of the extra sanctions that are going to be coming from the West, and most likely more heaps and loads of not only radiological aid to Ukraine, but probably larger economic, humanitarian, and military aid to Ukraine. Not to mention, wouldn't even be that strategically beneficial for them to use one of these tactical nuclear warheads, which would be one of the most likely type of warheads to be used in said scenario. It would most likely just be a weapon of terror. They'd have to use a whole lot of them to have a real substantive impact on the battlefield. We're talking like 50 to 100. And if they're using those many, then they're really breaking that taboo. They're really flipping a coin on the world ending. And the thing is, and whether Russia wants to change this reality or not, this is the sad reality for the Russians that they really wish they didn't have to deal with, is that if Russia was to destroy the world, they would destroy Russia too, because sadly, Russia is in the world. They exist on the planet. So if the planet was to go kaboom, that would also affect them. And on the other end of this war, there's also the United States, there's also the UK, there is Germany, and there is France, all states with world-ending weapons. So I don't think they're going to be using it. And I do think it is good that the Chinese emphasize their position on this, because they have as much interest as everyone else, definitely when they share a border with India and they have border disputes with the Indians, and a nuclear power, and disincentivizing the breaking of this taboo. Definitely when they also have the North Koreans on their border who have nuclear weapons and have those weapons aimed at the South Koreans in the United States, and they do not want a war on their peninsula, causing masses of North Korean refugees spilling over into China, as well as possible spillover from the war. And if the South Koreans win, which would be the most likely end scenario in this war, if you think that corruption in the Russian military was bad and they couldn't manage a war, boy howdy. Outside of the initial terror tactics, as the thousands of North Korean artillery guns aimed at Seoul unleash a peppering on the city, killing who knows how many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of civilians, and they unleashed the nuclear hellfire. After that, I mean, eventually they would lose, because there's just no way. They don't have the supplies, they don't have the manpower, they don't have anything that would be necessary to win that war. Definitely when they're going to be fighting not only the South Koreans, but most likely the Japanese, the United States, possibly the Taiwanese, possibly the Australians, the New Zealanders, who knows who else, if maybe other Western nations would get involved. And it would be very difficult for the Chinese to get involved on their side if they are the aggressor. If they're the defender, it'd be a lot easier. But if they're the aggressor, it's going to be near impossible. Anyway, we're getting off track. But I'm just saying that they have deep interest in this not happening, and the nuclear war not happening. And according to secret negotiations that were leaked between the United States and China on the subject of Ukraine, one of the things that was negotiated is that the United States would stop certain types of shipments like F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine, in return to the Chinese having their generals go to Russian generals that they had met through joint military drills and trying to convince them that if Russia and Vladimir Putin ever gave them the order to use nuclear weapons, for them to undercut military command. And that's another issue. And this is the number one rule of autocracy, is you never, ever give a rule, give an order that will not be followed by your subordinates. Because once that order is not followed, not only do you just have egg in your face and the order wasn't followed, so they didn't get what you wanted, but it also degrades the rule of your government, because then people can realize, if you don't punish that person and then make somebody do it, oh my God, you can stand up to the dictator. You can stand up to the central power. You can stand up to the Kremlin. And then the power base of Vladimir Putin has started to crack, has started to crumble. And I'm not even going to get into the state of Russia's nuclear arsenal. Anyway, putting all that aside, I wanted to think about a little bit, because this isn't really super detailed plan from the Chinese, right? It didn't get super into the details. So I wanted to look at some other ideas about what China or a party that is deeply interested in what Russia wants would negotiate in a possible peace plan.
Devin San Luis got a Tier 1 subscription. Asterisk Devin San Luis asterisk got a Tier 1 asterisk subscription.
Devin, thank you so much for the Tier 1 sub, and welcome to the glory That is site chat. Now I'm gonna answer questions after I finish the segment. Okay, so everybody who has questions about this segment, wait for a second. I'm gonna finish. So this guy is somebody who's very, 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 very supportive of the Chinese government, very sympathetic towards the Chinese government, and he did a thread about the official Ministry of Foreign Affairs like position on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis, yada yada yada. And it goes through everything from, you know, its section like reaffirming territorial integrity to like its position on the use of atomic weapons to everything. It goes through all of it. Here's the full statement, point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4, all of it. If you wanted to read it on your own, I guess you can, you know, here it is. I guess you could pause the stream intermittently if you wanted to read it all on yourself. We already went through the biggest points here, but the reason we're looking at this tweet is because they wrote up their own proposal for what they think the Chinese would push, what they think would be a good idea to push as a potential end of war peace plan. When we like the big map at the end of the day, like who would get what. And so I wanted to look at it to show you guys just how garbage this position is and why when people call for negotiations instead of supporting Ukraine, you should immediately ask them, what is your peace proposal? Because the problem is most of the people who are calling for immediate negotiations and ceding to Russian interests don't want the egg on their face of accepting just how bonkers, how crazy Russian demands are. And I can say the demands we're going to look at would be very similar to what the Russians would in actuality probably request. So here is the Twitter users' proposed peace plan in line with the interests of the Chinese state. So let's look at it. So first things first, it seems that the entirety of the territory captured by Russia so far in the war is kept by Russia. Not only that, but it is expanded to include all of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, meaning that not only does this peace plan enshrine every inch of territory the Russians have captured up to this point, it expands it further, which would require the Ukrainian military pulling out of Kramatorsk, which I have visited personally and met the locals who don't want Russian occupation, and other locations like Bakhmut, which is currently feeling the full brunt of Russia's so-called liberation, which means the leveling of their cities as it's slowly turned into a goddamn parking lot. Austria 7th, thank you so much to the primer and being subbed for 5 months. Great plan, China, Omega lol. So that's the first thing. It enshrines the annexation of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, and Crimea. Now, it doesn't have the entirety of Kherson Oblast. It seems that they are saying that Kherson gets to go to Ukraine. I guess after Ukraine's bold counteroffensive there, they have to give that to them. Zaporozhye seems a little unclear. It seems to have like an X through it. If we go to like a live map of Ukraine, you can kind of see what I mean here. Let's go to a more updated version. If you go to Zaporozhye, it's divided on the river. The city with most of it being on this side of the river, meaning in this peace plan, they would divide the city in two and give the majority of it to this, and this is the big part that really shocked me, the demilitarized zone. So they would split that up in half and give it to part of it to this demilitarized zone. Other locations that would be given to this now mythical and created demilitarized zone. I mean, everybody knows the demilitarized zone. Very famous country. Everybody knows demilitarized culture, music, language, food. Who doesn't love demilitarized food? Very long, ancient people, the demilitarized, very long and ancient. Been part of Ukrainian and Russian history for a very long time. This zone would include Zaporozhye, Dnipro, Poltava, Kharkiv, Sumy, and East Kiev. This would see Kiev split in two, the capital city of Ukraine, where the Ukrainians push the Russians back. They pushed them out of Sumy. They pushed them out of East Kiev. They defended Kharkiv. They defended Poltava. They defended Zaporozhye. They defended Dnipro. They defended and retook all this territory, only for it in this mythical peace plan to be given up into the demilitarized zone. Now, I want you to note something about this demilitarized zone. Not a single inch of it is within the Russian Federation. Isn't that interesting? That all of the demilitarization seems to be one-sided. That the nation who caused this invasion, the nation who's doing the majority of the bombing, the nation who is attacking, the nation who caused this issue in the first place, the nation that has slaughtered who knows how many hundreds of thousands of people, filled up mass graves in locations like Izium. There's no demilitarization from the aggressing party, from the party that committed the crime under international law, known as the crime of aggression against another state. They don't need any demilitarization. The nation that needs the demilitarization is a nation that defended itself. The Russians couldn't capture Kharkiv. They couldn't capture Sumy. They couldn't capture any of Kiev. They couldn't capture Poltava. They couldn't capture Zaporozhye. They couldn't capture Dnipro. They couldn't capture it by normal means because the Ukrainians resisted. The people that they claimed they were coming to liberate fought them back tooth and nail. I've met them myself. These Russian-speaking people that the Russians are coming to liberate are actively shooting back at them, rejecting their liberation with an answer of hot lead. All of that effort thrown into the air, all of their defenses demolished, and the Ukrainian army has to withdraw across the Dnipro River. Meaning that if the Ukrainians were to say, spend the next 5 years respecting this agreement, you know what the Russians could do? They could lick their wounds, they could regroup, they could train all of these conscripted people, they could train all of these Wagner prisoners that are currently being used like meat being shoved into the grinder. They could get the ammunition, they could fix their logistics, they could plan, they could recuperate, they could restructure their command and control, which has been a complete mess for the entirety of this war. They can get their domestic production ready. And with this peace plan would also mean the removal of sanctions, meaning Russia could then import the foreign parts necessary to make long-range rockets that they could then, if they wanted to start the war again, could take out electricity in Kiev, in Lviv, in Odessa, in Kherson, in Kharkiv, and all these locations, and they could relaunch the war. Relaunch the war next time, while Kharkiv will no longer be defended. It will have no means to defend itself. Sumy will have no means to defend itself. Poltava, no means to defend itself. Zaporozhye, maybe the Ukrainians could get the troops over the river in time if the Russians don't use the newly imported and created with Western parts, because the sanctions have been removed, long-range missiles to blow up the bridge, making the defense of Zaporozhye completely impossible. Same with Dnipro. Same with East Kiev. It would be a race against the clock for the Ukrainians to rush into the demilitarized zones as the Russians find no resistance outside of the same Ukrainians who 5 years prior, in the last year of fighting that we have seen, thrown themselves physically in front of tanks, protested against them before Russian soldiers mow them down like they did in occupied territory already and fill up more mass graves like we saw in Izium, which had the largest mass grave since the Yugoslav genocides with 440 bodies, or Bucha, or any other locations like Cherniv and Sumy and any other location that we found these large swaths of mass graves. Russia concedes nothing in this peace proposal, even though they're the aggressing party, they're the one at fault, they're the one that disturbed the peace in the first place. This is a ridiculous proposal. Let's recap. So, Ukraine gives up all of the territory that the Russians have captured, including more territory like Bakhmut and Kramatorsk, which they have fought tooth and nail for, bled and died for. So they give up all of that. So that's Crimea, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. But this gracious Twitter account and the gracious Russians might let them keep the city of Kherson. How nice of them. How nice of them. After they already murdered people in the city and looted it of all of its washing machines, microwaves, and copper wiring. So they give up that territory. The Ukrainians then make what is essentially one of the next largest states in Europe. When you look at how much territory is demilitarized here, this is the size of a large European nation. This is bigger than Moldova. I think this is bigger than Bosnia. This is bigger than Serbia. This is bigger than Croatia. This is bigger than a lot of European countries. I think it's bigger than the Netherlands, possibly. Bigger than Belgium, Luxembourg, Denmark. They give up half their country, more than half their country, really, to either be occupied by the Russians or be turned into a proxy state. This is some demilitarized zone purely to satisfy their interests with no means to defend itself, while the Russians demilitarize nothing and give up nothing in concessions whatsoever. And to top it all off, once it's all said and done, the Ukrainians also cannot enter any defensive alliance to make up for the fact that they were demilitarized. This is a ticking time bomb. This proposal is not a plan for peace. This proposal is a plan to move the war 5 years in the future, giving the Ukrainians less means to defend themselves and less ability to fight off the invasion. This plan will never be accepted under any circumstances, ever, 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 at all, ever. Never. This plan will never see the time of day for the Ukrainians. They'll never accept it. And if they do accept it, then the Ukrainian people should take the people who signed that peace deal and lock them up for treason. Because there's no means that any Ukrainian with any brain cell could look at this plan and accept it unless they're literally an agent for the fucking Kremlin. Because anyone from 10 miles away with the slightest bit of foreign policy experience or knowledge on how you negotiate with the Russians would know that this plan is just a plan for Russia's success, not now, but 5 to 10 years in the future once they've licked the wounds. And the Ukrainians will have no one to come to their defense. No one. They'll be part of no defensive agreement. They'll demilitarize themselves, and they'll be giving up large swaths of their territory away. The anti-imperialist Chinese. Very wonderful. Very fantastic. This is an embarrassing peace plan. This is a disgusting peace plan. Anybody who entertains this for more than a microsecond is a knuckle dragger and has no clue what they're talking about. Now, this right here is exactly why when you hear all those people during that Rage Against the Machine rally, they don't start saying, here's my peace plan, here's what I suggest, is because if they were to start listing out the things that would probably meet Russian demands, which I know it sounds crazy, but this is probably pretty close to Russian demands. In fact, you know what the Russians have demanded in order to have peace? Recognition of the annexation of Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, the demilitarization of Ukraine, and a guarantee of Ukrainian neutrality, not joining any alliances. This is basically exactly what the Russians want. So when you think about Russia and Ukraine negotiating, this is an outline of what the Russians would offer the Ukrainians. It's probably not exactly it, right? Because we don't know exactly what they've offered yet. That hasn't been made public, but we know their public demands, and this is pretty damn close. So now that you've seen exactly a general ballpark estimation of what the Russians could possibly be asking for in negotiations, now you can understand how ludicrous it is to look at this conflict and just say, negotiate. If this is the proposal from the other side, how do you find a middle ground with this? How do you find a middle ground with this? The situation, the balance of power in Ukraine has to shift more before negotiations happen, or the Russians just need to be pushed out of the country, because this is ridiculous.
Occurred is occurred.
This is ridiculous.